For those of you who haven't made it to high school yet, here's something to look forward to. For those of you who are well past high school, and then some, I invite you to dig deep into the recesses of your memory and hear this. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. This poem by Edgar Allan Poe continues on, telling the story of a person who has a night of reckoning, if you will, with nothing other than a raven. The raven is the one who comes and provides this night of reckoning. He is the source of the tapping and the rapping, and this raven comes in and perches and declares with every pondering of the man, nevermore. It's a haunting poem, The Raven, it's called, and it ends rather bleakly, saying something about the spirit, the hope and the energy of the person who has been encountered by the raven will never lift again, and nevermore is how it ends. Like I said, it's rather bleak, and it's a good thing that Edgar Allan Poe didn't write scripture. Really knowledge I've ever had of a raven throughout my life until I started reading the Bible and studying the Bible and got to this passage in 1 Kings 17 about Elijah, who is fed by a raven during a particular time. So let's just stop for a minute and consider the setting of this story, okay? The setting is during the history of the Israelites when they encountered and they had a broken kingdom. And after King David and then King Solomon, there was a power struggle, and the land separated between two peoples, the northern kingdom, which was called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. And so it was during that split kingdom time, and the northern kingdom was being ruled by a man named Ahab. He was not a whaler, but he was the king of Israel at the time, and as the story and the chronicles about King Ahab go, Ahab was not a good king. As a matter of fact, whenever there was a king who was not good, it's always says something about those kings. And Ahab did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And that whenever there's not a good king, that's always the summary of them. And they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And what a king does that is evil in the sight of the Lord is to go after other gods. Because Israel is supposed to be a nation that is dedicated to Yahweh, the Lord that brought them out of slavery into Egypt, from Egypt, and brought them into the promised land. This is the God of the Israelites. But once they got settled, the Israelites a lot of times would go after other gods. They would start worshiping the gods of their neighbors because they were probably, some sort of slick packaging, slick advertising. Maybe they had just a little bit better advertising scheme, those gods, or something like that. And so what is about to take place then with the Israelites is they're going to experience a famine. Tough times are coming, and there's not going to be any rain in the land, and not having rain in an already desert, dry region is catastrophic. It's tantamount to catastrophic. But God directs Elijah's life in such a way so that Elijah will be able to serve God through the whole time of hardship. God needs to make sure that there is a messenger for God's message to keep getting out to the king and to the people of Israel so that they would then eventually turn and return to Yahweh. So God sends Elijah kind of to his hometown, to his own backyard. Elijah's from a town called Tishbe, and like in the backyard of that there's a ravine called the Kerith Ravine, and in a ravine, just down in the depths of some of the rocky areas, there is, as naturally occurring a little body of water, perhaps a stream if there's enough water and it will run, but otherwise it might be just a little standing pool of water, something like that called a wadi. And water is available there during this time of drought and famine that will sustain Elijah. But it's not just the water in the wadi that God has for Elijah. God also, I feel like it's the very original DoorDash. Uber Eats, something like that. Because there is a delivery system of food to Elijah every single morning and every single evening. Bread and meat show up. And it's carried by none other than a raven to Elijah. And why a raven, you might wonder? Why a raven? Well, not clear, but I'd like to offer a few thoughts that might just help us in our own spiritual journey of perhaps what it meant for Elijah, and it might mean something for us. So the first thing for Elijah is perhaps the raven feels for Elijah a little bit of a kindred spirit, if you will. Ravens have been known throughout many cultures because they can mimic human speech, and because they are rather mysterious, and because they have this very big wingspan, and because they just kind of have a knowing look about them, that they're almost a mythological aspect to them, and they're considered a prophetic bird in many cultures. And so Elijah, being a prophet, he might have experienced a little bit of a kindred spirit with this raven, because Elijah is going to have to bring a message that King Ahab is not going to like. And that is the way it is with a lot of prophecy. It is a message that people don't necessarily want to receive, don't necessarily want to, hear. But nevertheless, Elijah is commissioned to do this. And so there is this raven who shows up, and perhaps Elijah feels, here's something that understands maybe my own self. Ahab, the king, had blamed Elijah for the drought. Elijah had said, there will be no more rain unless by the word of the Lord. And it hardened, I think, Ahab's heart. And Ahab went around, and his spin doctors basically said, Elijah is to blame. You know how that is in politics. You find someone else to blame. It's not your fault, obviously. It's someone else's fault. And that was what Ahab did. Ahab said, it's Elijah's fault. Hey, everybody, just know Elijah's the problem. It's not me. Elijah's the problem. And so Elijah is really kind of hiding out, not only to last out the famine, but people are searching for him. They're kind of trying to hunt him down. God has given him a safe place to hide out while Ahab is searching for him. And Ahab does not want to be called out for his idolatrous actions. But that's exactly what the prophecy is. So Elijah in Israel is going to become like the raven. He's a bit mysterious. He's not necessarily a welcome messenger. The raven just might help Elijah understand who he is and what his work is to be about. So maybe that's one reason why a raven. Maybe another reason has to do with God saying, I'm going to be who I will be. You see, when you stop and think about it, it might be perhaps a bit puzzling for a Jew who has been raised in the law to wonder about a raven bringing food. Because in Leviticus chapter 11, verse 15, there is a list of things that if you're an Israelite, you do not eat these things. Well, there's a lot of different things, but one verse has to do with certain kinds of birds that you don't eat. And this is from Leviticus 11. It goes like this. These are the birds you are to detest. Detest. Don't eat them. They are detestable. Eagle, osprey, vulture, kite, all falcons, all ravens. So there's this list, and people avoided these kinds of birds, a lot of times because they're predatory birds, but also ravens aren't necessarily predatory birds, they are carrion-eating birds. They are eating what has already died and is decaying, which makes you wonder, what exactly is this raven carrying for Elijah's breakfast and dinner each day? Is this the original Roadkill Cafe? I mean, you kind of got to wonder that. What's going on here? What exactly is he eating? And if it's kind of disgusting, which it very well may have been, Elijah had to trust. Elijah had to believe that this was from God. Elijah had to believe that this was a way that God is reaching out to him, and God is going to go even beyond what the law says, because God, you see, is Yahweh. And Yahweh is translated, Yahweh means I am. That is the name of God. Or better yet, I will be who I will be. Yahweh is completely free. Yahweh is not going to be boxed in. Try as we might to box God in, Yahweh here shows I'm not going to be boxed in. I am Yahweh, and this is who people need to be worshiping. Not Baal, not Ashtart, but Yahweh. Add to that the fact that ravens only care for their own. This tells Elijah that God shows up in some of the most unlikely ways to care for us and to carry us through trying times. The great I am. I remember a story about my grandma, one of my grandmas. I talk about her a lot. She was little, but she was a force. She lived to be 101, and she never wavered in her faith. And if she felt like she was wavering in her faith, she told God that he'd better buckle up and help her out because she was wavering in her faith. That was how strong she was in her faith. And yeah, she was pretty amazing. But Grandma had, just like all of us have, certain attitudes, presuppositions, different kinds of assumptions about people. And one day she had an accident. She was a part of the Oleos, which were old ladies eating out. And they would go and eat at this buffet every Sunday after church. And one Sunday, Grandma's coming out and, going out to the parking lot, and she trips and falls at the curb. And she lands just face down. And she tries to catch herself with her hand, of course, and breaks her wrist in the midst of it. And she's just laying there, prone. And this guy jumps down from his Harley Davidson. Big guy, long beard, sunglasses, and starts running over to her. And my grandma said to me, I thought for sure my purse was a goner and maybe me too. Because grandma had an assumption about this person. And what she experienced did not play into that assumption. This guy comes running over to her, ma'am, are you okay? And helps her up, gets her purse for her, stays with her until she gets into the car. And she said, Lisa, God sent somebody I wasn't expecting to me. And this is the way God acts. God will not be boxed in. And Elijah needed to remember that, or to know that, because this was the God that Elijah was going to remind the people who they worshiped. This was the God. So why a raven? Well, could be so that Elijah had a kindred spirit. It could be so that Elijah would know that you cannot box Yahweh in, that you will be taken care of perhaps in the most unexpected ways, but also perhaps for one other thing. Ravens find their food each and every day. They are not an animal like a chipmunk that collects up everything and stores them in my shed, and has a storehouse of hickory nuts from the front yard that are now in my shed. This is not the kind of animal that God sends to Elijah, a storehouse animal. God sends to Elijah the kind of animal that finds its meal and eats it, and then finds the next one and eats it. That kind of behavior engenders trust. As a matter of fact, Elijah just might be remembering how Yahweh has taken care of his ancestors in their wandering in the wilderness. Because what does God give to eat to the Israelites in their wilderness days? Manna, bread from heaven, and quail. Manna and quail. Oh, bread and meat once again. But something that the Israelites had to learn in the wilderness was that if you collected up the manna and you got nervous, wondering, will there be manna tomorrow? So you collect up more than you need today for the next day. If you do that, what you have collected up and stored goes bad. There's the story of how the manna became moldy and full of maggots or something gross like that. And it couldn't be eaten then. So the Israelites in the wilderness had to learn and trust that what God would provide, what they needed for each day, God would provide. And Elijah needed to learn that as well. Because in times of scarcity, our propensity is to hoard. Our human response to scarcity is fear and wanting to just keep it all to ourselves. Do you guys remember the toilet paper shortage at the beginning of COVID? Never understood that. I never understood why toilet paper was so scarce. But everybody was hoarding toilet paper. It was the weirdest thing. But it shows you how we act in times of fearfulness, in times of scarcity. We hoard. It's mine. I'm not sure what tomorrow's going to bring, so I'm going to... And you know what? That's the first step away from God. When we start trusting more in ourselves than we do in God's provision, that is the first step that we take away from our relationship with God. And then we take the next step. And then we take the next step. And the next thing you know, we are only trusting in ourselves. We have no space to even believe that God could possibly take care of us. We end up in idolatry, which is where Ahab was. Worshiping other gods, the god of money, the god of myself and my own provision. The heart of part of the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples, it says what? Give us this day. Yeah, you know how it goes. Do you really pray it? Or do you just say it? Because really believing that means that God will be there in your tomorrow. You trust that God will be there in your tomorrow. I don't have to pray for tomorrow's bread. I'll pray for today's bread. And I trust that God will be there in my tomorrow, so that my tomorrow will be my daily bread ask as well. And I know that it can sometimes feel like a bit of a spiritual tightrope that we're walking with this. Balancing out trusting in God and also putting the Lord to the test. It's like, I'll just be frivolous with all of it because God will give me what I need tomorrow. I don't know. But balancing out trusting in God's provision while continuing to be a good steward is what we need to do. In our context, we might, during scarce times, worrisome times when gas is so expensive, we might worry about hoarding into our savings account to the detriment of our ability to be generous. And that, too, takes a hit on our spirit. So Elijah needed to learn, not only in principle, but he needed to learn in practice that trusting in Yahweh was absolutely essential, because he was going to have to prove to everybody that his God was real. And that the gods that they were going after, that the people of Israel were going after, the Baal and the Ashtart gods, that they were not real. As the story goes, Elijah ends up having this kind of showdown between Yahweh and the gods of the Baal gods. And the priest of Baal, he's like, let's see whose God shows up. And I believe that it's only because Elijah had a season of really trusting in God that Elijah was able to do that. Elijah learns from the raven and the wadi. And then he learns the same principles as God moves him from that raven-fed existence to another existence in Zarephath, where he experienced once again during a time of famine, time of scarcity, he experienced abundance. Because it was a miraculous thing that happened. The widow at Zarephath, she gave him a meal. She says, this is the last of my flour, this is the last of my oil. Let's make a loaf of bread and we'll eat it, and it'll be the last food we eat. And so they did, but the next day there was still some more oil and more flour. And then the next day, after they ate that oil and flour, the next day there was still some more, and there was still some more, and there was still some more. I want to ask you to let Elijah's raven be a symbol to you of God's providence, of God's sustaining grace in your life, that God will be there in your today, and you can trust in your tomorrow, because by the time tomorrow comes, it'll be today, and God will be there too. this table that we're about to gather around, it's not been set by ravens, but may it remind us that God is present, providing for our deepest human need through Jesus Christ our Lord. So let's gather at this table.